Hey guys, Ross from Hack Perception. We're back again today. We've got a very exciting interview with David Gilbert. Just before we get into the detail of that, I wanted to just say a special thanks to Fab Atelier, which is a creative studio which we're in today. It's a new creative studio which is showcasing film, photography, and also going to be the home to a new food and lifestyle blog. So look out for links on the end of this video. But to start off, David, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming down today.
Pleasure.
Really good to see you. So we've got quite a bit, as usual, on Hack Perception. We like to try and touch on quite a few topics, and we're looking at several things with you today. So David is the chairman of an organisation called Creative United, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. I also understand, David, that you've got an interest and active work in philosophy. We're going to hopefully touch on that. And slightly more unusual, we wanted to touch on some ideas around, coming from philosophy, but looking at some concepts of, reality and some more, I'll let you speak about those, but some unusual things that we're going to discuss later on.
Sure.
So to start it off, really, could you give us a little bit of background on, where you came from to get to where you are today?
Well, at university, I studied literature and European history and philosophy.
Okay.
And I think when you go to university, you either go, I can't get out of here quick enough and go and get my first job in finance, or you go, these are ideas that are actually quite extraordinary, and I could possibly spend the rest of my life looking at that.
Yeah.
And I was sort of caught between two stools, so I simultaneously looked for a job and I pursued an academic interest that could have taken me down that career path.
Yeah.
Actually, what happened was I read myself to a standstill. And I read so many books and they were so difficult that I just couldn't read anymore. And so I got myself a job, and I landed the job of a lifetime, which was being the buyer for records for Boots the Chemist, who in those days one of the key distributors.
Yeah.
So, we were just sort of going to all these gigs all the time and being paid for it, and it was great. But anyway, that sort of all lasted for a few years and fizzled out because it got a bit boring after a while, and I joined Dixon Stores Group at that time, and 23 years later I left, having become the managing director of Currys and the main board director and all sorts of things, and sort of been through quite an interesting journey, but a journey that was entirely vacant in terms of intellectual engagement or any kind of spirituality, however you wish to define that.
So it sounds like you say you've been on quite a journey to get where you are today. And it's kind of interesting as well that you've got these kind of almost juxtaposition of these two things. You don't normally see hand in hand, finance and philosophy, or finance and spirituality. It's quite an unusual mix. So Creative United, is this kind of how the two have merged together in a sense?
Well, how the two merged together is a kind of infinite range of cafes that you can visit in Somerset House, where you can variously talk about business or arts with people who are interested in both.
Right.
So I'm quite blessed in having found myself in that location. But I think it's to do with the people who you know, really, and it's not a question of trying to fuse, if you like, business values and business objectives with philosophical values, though you can do that. And I do that minimally, but I know people who do that in a substantial way. It's more a question of buying a ticket to meet people whose ideas are extraordinary or radical, or make you think, I never thought that way before. I've never seen things that way before, and I'm astonished by your perceptiveness. And that's the kind of privilege of being in the right milieu of people who constantly surprise you with their insights.
Definitely. So for those who don't know, what does Creative United do?
Well, we're a business that's born out of the Arts Council. We were previously part of the Arts Council, but we were given our independence a year and a half ago, and whilst we're still financially substantially supported by the Arts Council, what we do is innovative finance for creative businesses. So we find new ways of using money to make creative businesses successful. Last night we were at our Christmas party, the Creative United Christmas party, which, apart from the most spectacularly good Turkish version of char-grilled bream that I've ever had in my life, albeit I've only had one. We then went to a place called Opera Up Close, which is a popular opera company. Keek said you've probably.
I did see a bit of that on one of your showcases, actually. Yeah.
Well, we were there last night, and they did La Bohème, and my wife keeps on telling me that every time she takes me to the opera, I say I really enjoyed that. In principle, I don't get opera, but I do enjoy it. And last night was just fabulous, because this is a very, very young company that's needed some money in order to expand and to become viable, I think. And we provide them with that loan capital, and off they go and do their creative thing, and they're super grateful to us, and we're extremely pleased that companies like that benefit from our money.
Yeah, well, so again, just for people who may not be aware, I got to witness a small performance of opera up close at a Creative United event, and this is just one of many exciting creative projects that your organisation helps with, and these guys, it's opera. There's this perception it's quite stuffy, and it's a kind of privileged, elitist kind of thing. But as the name says, Opera Up Close literally is opera being performed right next to people in the crowd, coming from any direction. And certainly when I saw it, I was blown away. I thought it was fantastic.
It is. And last night, the one of the acts of the opera took place in the pub rather than on the stage behind the
Brilliant.
pub, unbeknownst to the audience. So it was very surprising and extraordinary. But yes, they're the kind of businesses that we support, and we do other things as well. But that's I think our most substantial and interesting program at the moment. Yeah,
so I saw that. I think just to give it a kind of broader stroke, I think there's obviously people who are involved in music, people who are involved in fashion. Generally anything creative, I guess goes for what you do.
Absolutely. I mean, we've supported jewellers. We've supported that a company that's selling flat caps in Yorkshire, a new take on flat caps in Yorkshire, and she's been very successful, and she's actually got a deal with the England rugby team apparently for her flat caps. So that's a good start. But we feel that we're only just at the beginning of that particular journey, and we have available to us over £15 million now. So there's many people in the money too who want to get the message out. You want to borrow some money, you can come and see me if you're a creative business.
No, it's really
in
good.
Somerset House.
Yeah.
In a lovely cafe.
Yeah. So just for the guys, is there any website links, things like that you want to just throw out there?
It's www.creativenited.org.uk.
Okay. Yeah. We'll stick a link on the end of the film as well.
Yeah, so I think that's right. If not, it's close.
Yeah. But no, I think it's really, really interesting, and I think that the kind of path from taking something that people would kind of see normally, finance as a kind of very dry, boring subject, perhaps, especially for people from a kind of creative background, to then use that skill and knowledge to create something where you're funding creativity. I think it must be a really rewarding, thing to do.
It's extremely rewarding, and I think the reason why we get so much support from the Arts Council and from so many other areas is that we try to deliver what's called leveraged finance. In other words, if you give us £1, we'll make that £10 or £20. So we also do an interest-free credit scheme for original works of art, and so the funding that we get for that provides the capability for dealers and artists and galleries to give customers very positive, very good terms for buying works of art, and that's going extremely well too. So
that's really good. I think just for the kind of audience that Hack Perception's got, I know there's a lot of creatives out there, a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of people making their own films and stuff. So this was one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you on here, to get that message out, definitely.
Well, we're very, very grateful. So thank you very much.
So kind of moving on a little bit then, we've touched on philosophy. You've mentioned it, and different kind of creative thinkers that you've kind of come across in your own journey. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're doing in philosophy these days? What's the, is it just an interest? Are you involved in any groups, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm involved with a group, and they're called the Pinner Philosophy Group, which is one of many local philosophy societies that have been actually around for quite a while. And what do? Is they have a group of people, some of whom are philosophers, some of whom just have a lot of general life experience, and talk about these sort of fundamental questions. But the way I got into philosophy really was from the world of the arts, because that's my particular speciality, I suppose. And so I was very interested in how how problems that were addressed by artists or writers were addressed in a different way by philosophers, and whether they matched, whether they didn't match, and how the perceptions were different depending on which prism you're looking at the problem through. And so before I got involved with philosophy, I suppose I spent most of my time looking at modernist art or modernist literature, and that's a very good way to prepare yourself to move into a much more contemporary world, because the fundamental thoughts of those great thinkers and those great artists really set the foundations for what's occurred since then.
And have you found with your kind of study so far that it's something that we've spoken about on Hack Perception before, about this kind of thread of continuity which is kind of running through things in philosophy? Have you found that to be the case, or have you found it to be very much kind of insular, separate kind of movements? I know it's a very broad kind of question to ask, but
well, I think the issues that are being tackled are the same, and sometimes it feels like they're coming through the same, or looking at things in a similar way, but that can often be a very misleading way of thinking about things. So I would say that fundamental issues like the question of mind and body, or perceptions of reality, or the basis of reason and things like that, run right the way through philosophy. But when you look at philosophers of today, of the sort of second part of the 20th century, the ideas just become much more extreme in many ways, because I think we're dealing with a much more extreme political and social and humanitarian paradigm, not least what's been illustrated so sadly in the last 48 hours in Pakistan. It's a completely different way that we live our lives, and I think there's a sense in which time has speeded up because the capability to execute, whether they be crimes or whether it be technological innovation, is that much greater. But on the other hand, it's also slowing down. And how is it slowing down? Well, it's slowing down because the capacity to change things through human intervention becomes much more difficult. And so philosophers try to provide a kind of logical illumination to these questions. And at our philosophy society, we're hugely privileged to have people who come along and talk about these things, and you sit there and you listen, and after about 3/4 of an hour you go, I get this. This is really making sense. And then what happens, which is very amusing quite often, is that the professional philosophers are particularly aware of what the limit is of philosophy, where it stops working, because it's just utterly impractical and too theoretical. And it's quite interesting and insightful to note where it breaks down, and you have to start thinking in a different way. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question. I've sort of rambled around it a bit, but
it's there's a huge amount of information in that. That's a lot for me to process, actually. But I think the concept you mentioned there about this kind of exponential growth is quite an interesting one. I think it's something that I think we talked about it off camera before, around some of the philosophies and ideas of Terence McKenna about this ideas. Trying to think what the easiest way to say it, but what was it? His novelty theory, he calls it, about this idea of the kind of closer you get to the truth, the more complex it gets, and the more infinitely fast it kind of grows, if you like. And also you mentioned about how humanity has got the ability, I guess, to kind of impose its will faster as well. I sort of think that's what you're kind of saying, that now we've got technology and we've got medicine and whatever, that creates clearly a very, very different world to 100,000 years ago, because we are imposing our will on our reality very much so.
Well, that's so interesting. So first of all, I think there's lots of words in philosophy that are really loaded, and one of them is the word will. And I mean, they're loaded both in terms of how many different philosophers have talked about the will, the idea of the will, and then the kind of historical appropriation of those words by fascism, actually. And so I don't think I'm going to kind of pursue that too deeply, because that's a big subject, and it's quite a complex one, but it tends to lead you into a bit of not a cul-de-sac, but there's a kind of particular historical context within which that discussion is very significant. I think that there are kind of two big ideas here that are underneath this conversation. The first of which is actually one big idea, and it's called, what is progress? So there's this wonderful British philosopher called John Gray, who wrote The Silence of Animals. I might have to correct that, I think it's called Silence of Animals. And his big idea, quite depressingly to some, is that there is no such thing as human progress. Right. It's completely, utterly fallacious. There's technological progress, so if you have a toothache, you can get your tooth fixed more quickly. Although in my archaeology magazine, I did find, I think, the world's first artificial tooth, which is several hundred years old, but that's a bit of an aside. But anyway, John Gray's fundamental point is that there is no such thing as human progress. It's a complete, it's a total fallacy, and therefore, when you see crimes against humanity that we see all the time, he would say, what more evidence do you need than that? And I kind of buy that, as a matter of fact. I totally, absolutely believe it, which is actually one of the reasons why you study philosophy, because you don't stop there. You don't think, Christ, I give up, I'll just retreat into myself. That's not what you do. You try and understand it, and you try and engage with that concept. But fundamentally, if you go back into sort of long history, and you go back to the start of Homo erectus, we don't know what the kind of life expectancy. Well, we do know what the life expectancy. We don't know what the values were. We don't know what the thoughts were of people. But we start to know those. Can answer those questions from around about 10,000 years ago in the Mesolithic period, and in the Mesolithic period, you start to see the evidence of religion and what's the word? The votive offerings being thrown into lakes, mysticism, and all of these things, alongside the need to conquer the environment, because without that you don't eat. Or it's as simple as that. And so, alongside my interest in philosophy, I've become incredibly interested in archaeology, and to me, I've got lots of passions, but they're sort of quite at the top of the list.
Yeah.
And the reason I think I'm interested in archaeology is that when you look at what archaeologists do and what happens when they find things that are mysterious and unexpected, stories start to be told that reveal varying degrees of human progress, respect between people, or warfare. And so the Neolithic period, we're starting to discover that there were actually wars in the Neolithic period. So John Gray just goes, well, you lot, you're stupid out there. Can you not see that there was war 6,000 years ago, and look what's going on now? What's your problem? But where he goes from there is he says, so therefore this is how we should lead our lives. And this takes you into the idea of the outsider, what the role is of the outsider, which is very, very interesting. And from a philosophy point of view, Gray talks very much about J.G. Ballard, and so what you find is that Gray's reference, in fact, John Gray was a very great friend of J.G. Ballard's and tells some wonderful anecdotes about Ballard. But the reason he loved Ballard was he saw Ballard as being an outsider, and an outsider who could describe how our society is failing to develop in these fundamental ways, and can describe kind of the dystopia, which is, I know is a hackneyed phrase, of the shopping centre, because that's what he does, and he enables you to connect your immediate environment with all of its materialism, with some big ideas about progress not taking place. And so you know, with philosophy you have to, like anything, it's a bit like a menu. You pick what you like, and you know, I'm not terribly interested in analytical philosophy, because that's about logic. I know lots of people who are, and I totally respect that. But I'm looking for these insights that I'm trying to share with you.
The purpose of philosophy is to ponder it, I guess.
Well, I think philosophers fall into different camps, and so some, I feel, are quite academic in their pursuit of, if you like, mathematical formulae, almost logical formulae that can establish absolute knowledge. But of course they always fail against that objective, and they understand that. So they continue to reveal the relativity of truth and knowledge as opposed to the absoluteness of it. It's just that they are moving. They are moving. Full stop. Whether they're moving towards anything or not, I have no idea. But the arguments develop. And then I think there are many other philosophers, and one I would mention at this point is John Berger, who I think are completely the opposite and are extremely political and angry. And you know, I think he's got every right to be angry because of things that have take place in our society in the name of, I don't know, religion, progress, whatever it is. If you aren't going to be angry about that, you're not alive. You know, what are you doing? And what's great about philosophy, and where I think it's kind of different from the world of the arts, is that it kind of embraces you in thinking about these things. It doesn't intermediate its argument through a third-party object. And if I can just explain it, because John Berger wrote an article in The Guardian last week, which was a very, very interesting article, where he was talking about literary translation, which is something I'm also involved in, literary translation. Very interesting, that. Really have. And his point was that so John Berger is a Marxist philosopher, and he's interested in trying to answer the question, how can you possibly be a Marxist after the Berlin Wall's being taken down, etc.? And he said, well, how can you possibly not be a Marxist when you look at what's going on in the world? But his point was that in the arts, and in particular literary translation, you have the mediation of an object, in this case a story or a poem or something like that, which becomes the conduit for an interchange between two people. And I think that's absolutely right. Equally, and that's why I love the arts, but equally in philosophy, you get as close to the kind of the argument in itself, or the thoughts in themselves, as you can possibly get, because that's what the content is of philosophers' messages. Now, I think that there's something very interesting in what you're saying about how, if you like, quotes from philosophy are being used and are kind of percolating through social media, etc. And I think it goes like this, and this is a rather kind of perhaps Neanderthal version of philosophy, but I'll share it with you anyway. And that is that I think the reason why philosophy is interesting is for this reason, and that is that we all ask ourselves questions from the meaning of life to the difference between, you know, what is the split between mind and body? Are we just bodies, etc., etc. Lots of people ask themselves those questions. Well, just pragmatically, I think it's very reasonable to find out what the world's greatest thinkers think in relation to those questions. So what was Kant's idea about morality, for example? And he came up with this thing called the Critique of Pure Reason, where he infused reason with moral values and concluded from that you should never shoot someone, you should never kill someone. Yeah. There we go. anachronism, I think that's good. And you can then go away and read, 400 pages of the Critique of Pure Reason and spend the rest of your life studying it, or you get that idea and you go, what do I do with it? And I think that's very, very interesting, because a lot of these ideas are actually very, very simple to say. There's no such thing as progress, but you can still lead a meaningful life. Is there a difference between mind and body? Yes, probably, and this is what it might look like. This is what the connection is, and various philosophers have looked at that. And so I think that if social media is kind of picking up on some of these minimal versions of philosophy and kind of stitching them together, I think that's great. But I think there's a kind of sense in which you then need to talk to friends about what it means and socialize and be social in your consumption of those ideas, which is what a philosophy society does actually.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you raised there as well, which is probably not, we haven't got time to talk about that today, but you raised the question about social media not being very social. But on the flip side to that, like we say, it's percolating into the, for want of a better word, the collective consciousness of the world. So
absolutely.
Do you personally think that this percolation of those kinds of thoughts and ideas, do you think that can have a positive effect on the future?
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword, and I mean, it would be easy to say yes, but the problem that we've got is that the owners of the communication media have agendas of their own and have political agendas, and I think we have to kind of warn ourselves that, and I know many people do, but I'm not sure that how widespread this approach is. We've got to warn ourselves, of the kind of political and economic framework within which these technological advances are taking place. I mean, actually, my own view is a slightly different one, and I think since in the 19th century the idea of the outsider started to emerge, i.e. someone outside of society whose opinions and insights are revelatory. And I was thinking when you were talking earlier about what's the connection, what is the potential for social media, or if you like, minimally stated but nevertheless powerfully stated philosophical ideas to change society. And that made me think about William Blake, because Blake obviously really was an outsider, but at the same time became embraced in his society up to a point, because a number of the things that he was saying and a number of the artworks that he created were perhaps misinterpreted, but also very beautiful and very seductive. And so there's a bit of a kind of double-edged sword here that I think we have to be careful about. So my own feeling is that there's a missing link that will be obvious to us in 100 to 200 years from now. And the way that I like to describe that missing link is in terms of what if you like, the spirit is of the internet and the capabilities of the internet as a technological medium, but also as a medium of expression, but an expression on its own terms, not an expression on our terms. And that's a very strange idea, and but I know artists who are doing things in this particular space and are quite difficult, but at the same time they're beginning to, I think, provide insights into what these technologies are really all about from a humanitarian, that's the wrong word, a humanistic point of view, an intellectual point of view, an aesthetic point of view, and a political point of view. And I think 200 years, 100 years from now, we'll look back on these days and we'll just be absolutely astonished by where those seeds of change actually were. I'm not sure I'm quite right about this, but that's my sense of it.
No, that's really interesting, and I'd be inclined to kind of agree with you as well that the internet, even in its infancy, has clearly become something more important and powerful than we could have ever imagined. And who knows where that's going to go.
Exactly.
And I think when you can look at it from, like you say, from all different kinds of levels, whether it's intellectual, artistic, and even spiritual, because if you look at certain, belief systems or concepts or ideas, what is the internet really? The internet is like a artificial global consciousness, which we're building and we're spreading and we're connecting and we're sharing, and you know, who knows where that could lead. I think it's really exciting.
That's right, and in saying that, it is not within our control. It has its own momentum. It has its own.
Yeah, it's kind of organic in a way. In
absolutely,
this odd way.
It is. Yeah. It is, and it's beyond us. But at the same time, it's the kind of victim, if that's the right word, of political and economic context. But I agree with you completely. I think it's way beyond that, and that's absolutely fascinating. And this is where, again, the discussion in the arts is so interesting, because what one tends to see. I mean, I'm pretty well networked into the world of visual arts and the world of literature, and less extent music, and I think it's only in the visual arts, and only very recently with some pretty radical artists, that you're starting to see this kind of idea reflected back in what they're doing. But it's very obscure and quite elusive. And it certainly isn't mainstream. And I haven't seen a lot, but I know it when I see it.
So clearly a topic that we could spend, a huge amount of time on, but I think it kind of links up quite nicely, given that we've expanded that out a bit now, and we've talked about a kind of the futures of the internet and a kind of global consciousness and that kind of thing. If we can then kind of swing the camera back around again and look at maybe some of the philosophical ideas that we'd like to discuss. And I know off camera you mentioned Plato's cave to me.
Yes, okay.
Could you share a little bit around what that is? The concept?
Right, okay, let me try and...
You've got 30 seconds.
Right, okay. So I did a talk at our Philosophy Society, which is on my highly unprofessional blog site, called Ways of Seeing, which is the title of John Burge's seminal book in the 70s about postmodernism, i.e. the way you look at the world, including art, is through the eyes of the media and what was called by Baudrillard simulacra, i.e. the continuity between the real world as we see it, media, advertising, etc. So the fundamental point being the relativity of what it is that you're looking at, understanding that you're looking at things through your perspective, blah blah blah, and then kind of it's impossible to separate your perspective from the reality. So my talk was really trying to track how Plato's idea, which was in the similar kind of space, developed particularly from the period of modernism to postmodernism. And so Plato's idea, his idea of the cave, was to try and demonstrate this point of relativity, i.e. that what you're seeing is relative to your point of perception. And the way that he demonstrated was through his story of the cave, where he posits a group of people, prisoners actually, sat in chairs, tied to their chairs inside this cave, looking into the cave, and all they could see were shadows of figures passing in front of them. And he hypothesizes that they had been there all of their lives, and therefore they had no idea what was behind them. In fact, what was behind them was this guy who was holding up these puppets, and the shadows were they throwing onto the back of the cave. So it was kind of, don't you realise it's all shadows? Well, no, because I've been sat in this sodding cave all this time and they've not let me out, That's my way of putting it. He didn't quite put it that way, actually. I've just totally butchered one of the greatest pieces of philosophy, but who cares, it's all amongst friends. So that was his point. I mean, actually what he then went on to say was a bit of a problem, because he then said, well, he posited that society generally is stuck in a cave, Greek society, and therefore the only people that you should back are your rulers, who are effectively the puppeteers. So forget kind of democracy. It's a sort of waste of time. Just hand over to the guys in power, the puppeteers, because they know best. Well, it's a crass simplification I've just articulated, but there we go. I just have. So that was kind of the idea of the cave, and in the 20th century, you start to see some extraordinary radical philosophical ideas from, in particular, the German philosopher Walter Benjamin, who wrote this extraordinary book called The Arcades Project. And in this Arcades Project, which is a huge book, it's about 800 pages long, and it's the most difficult book that you could ever. That and Finnegan's Wake, you know, that's not what you take to bed with you for a light read. So anyway, so what Benjamin was doing was trying to understand this idea of how our social milieu, how the streets that we live in, how the shops that we go to, how the clothes that we wear, kind of fuse with the consciousness of the time, the zeitgeist, and then how elusive and misleading they are, because they are all somehow a figment of A, one's imagination, but B, also the kind of social milieu of the time. I put that incredibly badly. What he's trying to say is, and I think I can explain it best by way of an illustration, is that he talked about the idea of the flaneur. The flaneur is a French word for someone who sort of hangs out in shopping centres and kind of wanders around and have a few coffees there and goes into shops here and has actually no real grounding of their particular being, because they're just part and parcel, drifting around within the shops, and it's all that part and parcel, that sort of thing. And so Walter Benjamin was very interested in talking about how this consumer society and the change in the way that, in particular, art was created, because he was interested in the transformation from painting to film, in particular photography. Brilliant the way they wrote about photography, absolutely brilliant. Was representative of a fundamental change in human society. Why? Because which is really a Marxist idea, the individual's propensity or capability for self-fulfillment has just been hijacked by virtue of you as an individual being part of the labour force to create wealth for capitalism. And so he's kind of tried to explain and document and illustrate how this movement had affected the media, different media in the arts, and how film was affected. And he talked about the alienation of the actor in film. And what was all that about? It was simply saying that unlike an actor on a stage who's got a live audience, the actor in a film doesn't, and therefore by virtue of the artificiality of that situation, it's an illustration of how life has changed, how society has changed, and how art's reflecting that change, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. I'm not sure that's terribly clear what I just said. It probably wasn't at all.
No,
I think that's it.
I think it was. I think it again, like these concepts are so huge, you know, for me to even ask that question to try and, you know, articulate that. I think I've done really well to try and encapsulate it. And it as these things do, it sparks many other questions. And I think maybe two that I'd like to talk around are, one of the first one is how relevant that is to today, how relevant that is to what we've just been speaking about, you know, this whole social media machine, the media machine, all of that is completely relevant.
Absolutely right.
And, you know, and secondly, on a more kind of intellectual, scientific, or even spiritual level, the concept around your reality being completely derived by your perception, again, I think is fascinating. I think it touches so many things. You know, it's not just something that sits in this intellectual box of Greek philosophy. No, of course, it touches all different philosophical levels, but you know, even science, you know, quantum physics, spirituality, the psychedelic movement, all these things are asking these questions. And what would, I know it's going to be another huge kind of question, but what is your kind of feeling around those ideas and how they relate to yourself in terms of, you know, the mind and body and a soul or a spirit and that kind of thing. Have you got any views, or have you come to any conclusions?
Well, I've got lots of views.
Yeah.
I'll try and see if I can articulate some of them. I think the first thing, I mean, I love the question about you know, what is the relevance of philosophy and Greek philosophy and all that kind of thing. I love that question, and at our philosophy group, it's great because it's a philosophy group, so people have come to the philosophy group to talk about philosophy, and then when you get into questions like, is that a table? Mm-hmm. Which actually I find quite an interesting question, but recognise that some might find that a bit absurd. You sort of say, well, hang on a minute, what are we doing here? What we're trying to do is to see if we can orientate ourselves to certain arguments, points, principles that help you to navigate the world. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, and I feel quite strongly about this because those of my friends who think that philosophy is just the kind of self-indulgent,
sort of
dry academic, are sometimes right.
Yeah.
But where they're wrong, where they're really wrong, is that I believe in a world of ideas as well as a world of material things. Mm-hmm. And I know that the biggest challenges that I've faced in my life, and I've faced a few, believe me, were variously helped or not helped at all by my understanding of what great thinkers thought about similar things. Mm-hmm. And so when you read, not so much Kant, but because Kant is slightly earlier, but you start reading Walter Benjamin, you suddenly get these moments of great insight, and they make things make sense, however obscure his way of articulating them might be. Mm-hmm. And I think where these great philosophical ideas are very, very useful is not in their complexity but in their brutal simplicity. And when you see atrocities take place in the world, you go back to these questions time and time again. And you know, I'm not going to go out and commit an atrocity, so I don't quite understand why these guys did.
Yeah.
You know? But I know someone who's got a theory about that, which is really, really interesting. And it makes you stop and think about the society that you live in, and stop, you know, just blaming other people for behaving the way they are. And so
yeah, it's almost like that. It, by having that intellectual exercise, I don't know, it kind of makes you take responsibility for your world, if you like. I don't know if that's what you're saying.
Well, yes, in the sense that you do have a responsibility for your world. You might not kind of appreciate it, or you might understand, but the big idea that's kind of behind that is this is what I'm sort of working on at the moment. Is from a philosopher called Fukuyama, and his idea was he came up with the idea. His expression was. The end of history. He was interested in the idea of the end of history and the last man standing. And the idea about the end of history is really, really important idea. And basically what he says is that because of the effectiveness of democracy, Western liberal democracy, and obviously technology is a massive enabler of that, with the communication capabilities, etc., etc. We've reached the end of history. By that he means no more progress can be made, because whatever your ideas are, they become subsumed within this kind of this softness and the accommodating capacity of democratic debate, liberal democratic debate, like this actually. It's exactly like this. And you know, and that doesn't mean you should stop having liberal democratic debates, but it means that one should be very self-aware of the kind of environment within which terrorism takes place, and you know, if you've got, through the eyes of the terrorist, this whole kind of Western world of capitalism, and materialism and
it's devoid of spirituality and God,
devoid
and
of
all these things.
spirituality, hyper, supercharged by technology and the investment in technology and the kind of pure consumption side of it, if you like. And I was talking to a friend of mine last night about the fetish of cars. He was talking about gets into quite good conversations. This was in this Turkish restaurant just before we went to go to the opera, and he was talking because the philosopher Baudrillard's quite interesting in his capacity. But anyway, my friend Nick was working on something to do with the theory of car design, and actually it's trying to capture, my words not his, the meaninglessness of it all, i.e. how utterly trivial the kind of marginal enhancement of the front end of a car is. What's the point of that? I mean, Karl Marx would not have supported that. To that point, and I keep on these asides. This is a good aside. My great friend Martin actually did an artwork which is connected with that, where he appropriated the number plates of a Lamborghini car that were parked in a car park in Soho. Actually, they were doing this art show, but his big contribution to the art show was that he basically took the number plates off this Lamborghini and replaced them with the words "Das" on the front and "Capital" on the back. Anyway, this car drove out of the car park in Lisle Street. This guy in a Lamborghini, and he got stopped by the police. Used some kind of a joker, and well, no, but this is the nature of the artist to make us think about these things. Anyway, getting back to the point, if you are in the mind of a terrorist, you've got against you the rest of the world, the political structures, the kind of moral structures, the intellectual structures, everything.
Well, I would say, just before you continue, I'd say it's not, the terrorist is a good example, but so is the free thinker, so is the artist, so is anything that's not the status quo.
Absolutely, completely. And actually that's the role of the artist, is to kind of, like my friend, shock you into going, Jesus, I never thought of that. And I think that what's great about some art, and certainly this kind of contemporary philosophy, is that there are simple big ideas which you go, aha, I get that now. And that doesn't, and where things go wrong is when you then read the next 300 pages and you go, well, actually this is kind of saying the same thing but in different ways. And it's not the point. The point is that the core ideas are great and they're very, very important. And for me, understanding what these ideas are about is fundamental to how you live a moral life. And so that's kind of one thing. I think the second thing is that you then sort of say to yourself, well, what do you go and do next, if you kind of seeing that, and that's really very, very difficult.
The so what factor.
And my take on that is that I'm not massively politically engaged, but I'm very artistically engaged, and I agree with you. I think that it's through the eyes of the Jeremy Dellers of this world, and the kind of way that he thinks about politics and about history. He did this great thing called the Battle of Orgreave, this film he made about the Battle of Orgreave, which since going back a few years now, which was his way of saying that you people, you think the last battle on British soil was in the 18th century. Well, it wasn't. It was during the miners' strike. So wake up, things like that. And I totally buy that. But equally, I recognise the paradox of saying that as being, working in a financial services type business. But I don't mind that. That's okay.
Yeah, well, I think this is the thing. I think we keep kind of going around it, and it's a very difficult thing to kind of wrap up neatly in any kind of way, shape, or form. It just doesn't work like that. But I think what we're kind of both saying is that the exercise of this kind of thinking, if nothing else, to give you a different perspective, is something useful and will help you lead a better life, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that we've got a lot else that
what
can
else
help
is
us actually, because I'm not sitting here thinking that artificial intelligence is going to transform people's lives in 100 years. Do I? Hell, not at all, because it has to operate in a moral system. I don't know where that comes from if it isn't from people who think about things like this. And I think that if you lead a moral life, what you're doing is thinking about these questions and Creative United in our own way, reasonably substantial way actually. We're enabling an industry whose fundamental principles are about freedom of thought, freedom of expression, originality, authenticity, which is a horrible cliche, but that's the best word I can come up with. That's what we're doing in our own pretty substantial way, and it's a very fulfilling thing to do. It's not what I was doing 15 years ago, believe me, not far from it. I was interested in how many fridges I was going to sell next week. I wasn't that interested. But someone had to pretend they were.
I think personally,
did my best.
I think it is fantastic that there are organisations like Creative United out there which, if nothing else, give a point of meeting for people, give a springboard for these kinds of conversations, give a springboard for creativity, and I think that's got to be a good thing.
That's right.
Yeah. Just finally on the kind of philosophical bit before I move on to our kind of last section was, and I don't know again how neatly we can kind of wrap this up into a small bit, but it was around the questions of what are your personal views, ideas, opinions on, I guess, life after death, the soul, the mind and body, those kind of concepts.
Right. Okay. So the thing that well, first of all, as I propose life after death and that specific point. One of the things that I'm working on is exploring the idea of the uncanny, and that's a kind of whole range of things that I can't begin to describe right now. But it includes trying to spot moments when things happen in our brains or outside there in the real world that suddenly trip you up from your kind of cozy, rational view of things and go, oh blimey, I didn't mean to think that. What happened there? And it's I've got lots of friends who I talk to this about, and I think whether it's life after death or whether it's about
well, maybe life after death. Maybe it's slightly the wrong word.
Yes,
but, I mean, I guess a continued consciousness or a continued awareness or that.
Well, I think the specific point is it's to do with. And forgive me for this one, but it's to do with what Kant was describing. There's a difference between, this is getting very philosophical, the difference between the noumenon and the phenomenon.
Yeah.
And
so it's like the object at the end of time stuff.
Well, what he was getting at was that everything in the world, including our thoughts actually, are part of the noumenon, the phenomenon, which is actually how we live in the world, the material world, if you like, to quote Madonna. The connection there, a fair connection there. And then there's this other thing called the so that's the phenomenon. There's something called the noumenon, and that's what is we can't describe. We haven't got words to describe it, and obviously this is very close to a lot of Buddhist thoughts, etc., etc. And what I'm interested in is if there is a noumenon, then what experience do we have it in our lives, let alone our daily lives? And what I'm interested in is what I'm describing is described by many philosophers and others as uncanny moments, i.e. moments when all of a sudden something strange happens that just trips you up. And in German it's called unheimlich, which is a very strange word, but also means strange, as well as not homely. Yeah. And so it's when either through, for example, people thinking that they're seeing ghosts, or people who believe that they can predict the future, all these kinds of phenomena, we will call phenomena. It's not a question of whether I kind of believe in those things or not, though I think that is an interesting question. Again, using philosophy, what insights do you get into understanding these kinds of things? And what I'm trying to do at the moment is spot those moments that are bridge-like between our world of phenomena and the numinous, irrespective of whether that demonstrates the numinous or not.
And does within that conceptual framework, does it make a separation between the two, between the phenomenon and the noumenon? Does it say they are completely separate entities, or does it suggest some kind of non-duality model?
Well, I mean, there are lots of different models. If you're asking me where I'm sort of placing my bet, no, I absolutely do think that there are kind of, there's a spiritual world and there's a material world. Absolutely, I do. Otherwise, you know, when we were at the opera last night, and it was a great opera, so enjoyed it. You know, I understand that people, you know, scientists will tell me the reason I enjoy music is because of this sort of synapses in my brain that react in a certain way. Well, I kind of don't buy that, I'm afraid. It doesn't feel like that to me, which isn't to say that it isn't in fact like that. It doesn't feel like that to me at all. And the evidence, in my view, doesn't support that. And I think that, you know, there are great thinkers throughout the centuries who've argued both ways, and that's one of the great things about philosophy is you see these great things. But you know, it's a very reasonable question you ask, and I maybe when I finished my piece of work on the uncanny, I can answer that more clearly, because at the moment I'm struggling.
Thank you for sharing that.
I've done my best with that one.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult. It's quite a difficult area.
I guess the last sort of question around philosophy, it's a very difficult one to encapsulate, but it was around these ideas of the, you know, a continued consciousness or the spirit or the soul or whatever language, and you mentioned to me, I don't recall the name, but you mentioned to me off camera, someone who had quite an interesting, that could be perceived as a sort of nihilist view, but perhaps not. Who was that?
Well, I mean, I think I was probably referring to Heidegger.
Yes, I think, yeah.
Right, let me just get this one right. So Heidegger, actually, there are two people that we should talk about here. One is Heidegger, and the other is Carl Jung. So Heidegger really refers not quite to this particular question. It was to do with the question about death, and Heidegger's point about death was that he said that the only thing that you really own is your own death. Which, thanks very much. You know, what about my car? I have a really nice car. Anything about that, Mr. Heidegger? But he didn't. He said it was just your death. And actually, what he was getting at was exactly the kind of the point I've just illustrated through my aside, which is the materialism has nothing to do with understanding the self. Quite the opposite. It's completely fallacious. It's utterly superficial, seductive though it might be. And therefore, what in Heidegger's view you had to do was kind of reduce things back to that one point of understanding. Once you got that point of understanding, you were then free, and you were able to fulfill yourself as a human being and understand your purpose in life, etc., etc.
And I guess while that could be seen in one way as a kind of nihilistic view, you could equally look at it in a very similar light to Buddhist ideas, for example, which just get one to accept impermanence and to meditate on death and to meditate on change and on all of those things. It's interesting when those kind of things that are seemingly opposite ends of the spectrum, that they're perhaps the same thing.
Well, absolutely it is, and one of our speakers at our philosophy group did a talk on Heidegger, and I recall now talked about this particular concept, and I think I asked him, you know, what does Heidegger mean for you? And he said it was this particular point that was kind of fundamental for him and freed up his thinking rather in the way that you're exploring. So I think that's interesting, hopefully. And Carl Jung is where one gets into this I think quite a difficult area of collective consciousness and the consciousness beyond me. And I'm far from an expert on Carl Jung, but I'm trying to read some Jung at the moment because Jung was interested in the uncanny. Why was he interested in the uncanny? Because he didn't buy Freud's version of the uncanny. It was the opposite of it. Freud thought it was all sort of chemicals and libido and Oedipus and all that kind of stuff. And Jung was into mass consciousness, which and very mystical, and was interested in all sorts of alternative views of reality and occultism and what have you. And he very much went down this kind of mass, the non-individual consciousness, the collective consciousness of which you are part. And he didn't sort of set out a set of logical principles that get you from A to Z, that being the Z. He just described these different ways of thinking about how we think and who we are. And so it's very interesting from that point of view. I think, if I may, I just want to share with you one particular arts project that I'm involved with, because I think it's very beautiful in this respect. So I'm a trustee of a thing called the Long Player Trust. And did I talk to you about this before?
I don't even mention that.
So Long Player Trust is a project that was conceived at 23:59 on the dot in the year 1999, and the project concludes in the year 2999 at 2300 hours and 59 minutes. So it's a 1,000 year long project, and this 1,000 year long project is a piece of music that was conceived by an artist called Jem Finer, who's behind Long Player, and it's a collection of if you like electronically recreated Tibetan singing bowls, the modulation of which play out across 6 different time sequences, such that in 1,000 years' time they synchronize again.
That's incredible.
I've just butchered that idea as well, I think, and I apologise, but anyway, I've heard it so many times, and I've struggled to. This is how I explain it back to other people, but I know it's not quite accurate. But the point is very, very, very simple point. To see it, it's in a lighthouse in Canning Town, which where else would it be? And it's at the top of the lighthouse with all the singing bowls there and computers. And I've been a trustee of this for a year and a half. It's connected with Art Angel, which is a really significant, great bunch of people. But the point is exactly your point. It is exactly the kind of the impermanence of me, but the permanence of my consciousness, if you like, in being engaged with this long version of time. That's exactly, in my view, what it's about. I mean, it's about lots of things. It's definitely about that.
No,
definitely about that.
That's a really thanks for sharing that, because that's a really, really interesting idea, a really fascinating concept.
It's a beautiful piece of art, actually, and we did a crowd-funded performance of it at the Roundhouse. Take a particular part of the score, and we get singers along, and they sing this. I mean, I don't understand how it works from the point of view of notation at all, but you just listen to the music in the Roundhouse and you understand it's a 1,000 year long piece of music, and you sort of go, aha, this is the problem with philosophy, and this is why art is so powerful. Is you know, when I do my philosophy talks, I always talk about art, because I run out of adequate ways of describing what philosophers were trying to say. Maybe because I don't understand them well enough, possibly, or because they stop at the point of logic, you know,
and at the point of language.
And the point of language, precisely. At the point of language, precisely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Exactly. Exactly. And so when you talk about 1,000 year long piece of music, or like Walter Benjamin did something he talked about, you sort of go, oh well, it's obvious. It's like this, isn't it? Yeah. And some people look at what on earth are you talking about? But I think, you know, if you understand these kind of big ideas, you're interested in them, it's these artists who've kind of brilliantly encapsulated those ideas, the longevity of consciousness without all the political baggage, because Carl Jung comes with a ton of political baggage, really dangerous ideas that he had that went the wrong way. You know, the legacy of these ideas is not necessarily a positive legacy. But when you look at the art, one of the artists very interesting is Paul Klee, the painter Paul Klee, and and Walter Benjamin wrote brilliantly about Paul Klee's art, because he talked about looking into the future and looking behind you, and there was a particular painting by Klee that represented this idea. The Angel of Destiny is what it was called, in a way that the kind of 800 pages of the Arcade Project struggles a bit to most people.
Yeah, but no, it's an incredible thing, I guess, when like we said, you run out of the words, and you know, a piece of music or art is what it needs to explain it. And exactly. Just to kind of somehow wrap up and finish on that, I think it's also fascinating because it links in with so many direct experiences that people have had as well. You know, when we start, not that it's the topic for today, but when we start examining dreaming and near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences and things like this, it does all point towards this, for want of a better word, a divine realm, which that is what art is about, and that's what love is, and that's what all of these concepts are. And you know, I think that, like you say, that to be able to work on or be involved in a project like that, it must be fantastic.
And where you're quite right is that the words sort of hijack the ideas, don't they? You know, the ideas are there, and then you kind of have to find some inadequate way always to express them, and they get loaded by stuff. But the core idea, and a friend of mine was telling me the other day that we were talking about books, and he said the reading my books are important is because they are telepathic. They're telepathic because you read the book, I read the book, we have different views perhaps, but the book creates the point of telepathy. It's the catalyst for the telepathy. And I think that the spoken word, the written word, and language per se are the poor cousins of music and
art,
visual art, but very necessary to provide a means of discourse that can be productive with regard to these objectives. Otherwise, you only have the abstract.
Yeah, totally. And you know, what an incredible area of discussion. I think we could be here for 1,000 years talking about these things. So, thank you very much for sharing all of those things. There's some amazing stuff in there. I feel we've already ran over hugely on this interview, so I just wanted to kind of finish up with anything that you'd like to share, any projects, other projects you're involved in, things coming up that people might be interested in, that you'd like to just share with the hack perception community.
Well, I'm shortly starting work with some friends to build this replica of the Saxon warship, the Saxon warship from Sutton Hoo.
Oh, of course you are.
That's not 1,000 years, but it might be 10 years, and we've got to raise some money for that one. But I'd like people to look out for that, because I think that's going to be a lot of fun. And we're going to definitely do some social media around the idea of a saga there, the kind of contemporary saga of building the ship, one's individual personal saga over those 10 years. And then the original saga, not that there was one actually of that particular ship, but obviously it was contemporary. There were contemporaneous sagas written at that time, alongside the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle references, actually not the Saxons so much, but the Vikings coming in. So we're going to have a lot of fun building this replica ship, and I'm sort of part of that group. So there's one to look out for.
Brilliant.
That'll be fun. And
have you got anything around the your either Creative United or the philosophy world that you've got upcoming?
With Creative United, we're very, very keen to talk to people who have been trading for, say, a year or two and need financial support to support their growth plans. And we don't want people to apply to us if they don't have plans that they believe in, but people who do believe in their plans and want to get their art or their creative ideas executed and are sort of suffering because they can't get finance from banks or wherever they're going. They're the people who we're out there to help, and we have got quite a lot of money potentially to support that group of people. And so it's called the Creative Industries Finance Programme. It's run by Creative United, and it's been very, very successful, and we love people who may be watching this video, if they're in that group, to apply, and we'd like to help them.
Excellent.
I might apply myself with a Saxon ship.
Yeah.
With a final irony, wouldn't it?
Okay, well, that's probably all we've got time for today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm sure we could talk for years and days on end about philosophy and ideas, but absolute pleasure, and really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you very much.
Complete pleasure. Pleasure's all mine, really is. Thank you.
Thanks,
so much.
David.